My dad kicked me out at 18 for getting pregnant. Years later, he begged to meet my baby's billionaire father. My father changed the locks on our house before he even told me I had to leave. I was 18, pregnant, and standing in his kitchen when he set down his glass of scotch and asked me, very calmly, who the father was. I told him the truth I didn't know. It was one night. A stranger. He looked at me like I was something he'd found tracked in on his shoe, and he said 2 hours. Pack your things, you have 2 hours. By the time I came downstairs with 2 garbage bags of clothes, the locksmith was already standing in the driveway. He'd called the man before he'd even told me to go. That's the kind of father I had. The kind who plans your exile before he gives you a chance to explain yourself. 6 years later, that same man would stand in my living room, in a house he had nothing to do with buying, and try to claim he'd never stopped loving me. And by the end of this story, you're going to watch exactly how far a man like that will go, not for love, not for forgiveness, but for money. Stay with me, because the ending of this one is not what you think. I want to take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who my father was before I tell you what he did. He ran our household the way some men run a business, for image, for appearances, for the approval of people who didn't actually love him. My mother died when I was 14. Cancer, fast and brutal, gone in a single summer. And in the years after that, my father didn't grieve the way other people grieve. He turned his grief into control. Church twice a week. The right car in the driveway, the right neighbors, the right things said at the country club. A pregnant, unmarried 18-year-old daughter wasn't a tragedy to him. She was a stain. A liability to the story he was telling about himself. I'd planned the conversation for a week. I picked a night when he'd had exactly 1 drink, calm, but not cold. I sat across from him and told him I was pregnant and that I intended to keep the baby. He didn't yell. I want you to understand that the not yelling was somehow worse. He set his glass down with this terrible, deliberate slowness, like he needed a second to decide what kind of man he was about to become. Then he asked who the father was. The truth was almost laughable in how little I had to offer him. A boy, a man, really, who'd gone by Henry. We'd met during freshman orientation. He said he was visiting from somewhere in Europe. I didn't even catch where exactly. One night. No number, no last name. Gone the next morning, and I never saw him again. My father stood up without a word, walked into the kitchen, and came back holding a calm that I can still feel in my body when I think about it. He told me I had 2 hours. He said the word disgrace slowly, twice, like he was tasting it on his tongue. And then he reached for the only weapon he knew would actually land. He told me my mother would be ashamed of me. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew my mother, more than anyone alive, would have pulled me into her arms that night. He used her memory as a blade because he understood precisely where it would cut deepest. I packed 2 garbage bags while he watched from the doorway. He didn't help. He didn't soften. When I came downstairs, there was already a van in the driveway with a locksmith's logo on the side, drilling out the front door lock while I stood there holding everything I owned. He had made the call before he'd said a single word to me. That detail has haunted me for 6 years, not the eviction itself, but the planning of it. The fact that my exile was already in motion before I'd even finished explaining myself. I slept in my car the first 2 nights. An old hatchback that happened to be registered in my name, the one thing he hadn't thought to take, because taking it back would have cost him an insurance discount. On the 3rd day, a social worker at a free clinic got me a bed at a women's shelter on the east side of the city. That shelter became my home for the back half of my pregnancy. There's a memory from that intake desk I will never lose. The form had a little check box near the top, abandoned youth. The volunteer paused with her pen hovering above it and asked me gently if there was really no one, no parent, no guardian, nobody. And I told her the truth. No, there's no one. She checked the box. I had no idea, sitting in that plastic chair 8 months pregnant, how much that single checkmark would matter years later. Before I keep going, if stories like this, real stories about family, betrayal, and the kind of justice that takes years to arrive, are the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe now. We post stories like this regularly, and trust me, you do not want to miss where this one ends up. Okay, back to the story. I went into labor on a freezing February morning. I rode a city bus to the county hospital with a bag I'd packed weeks early, and I delivered my daughter completely alone. Except for a nurse named Patris who held my hand, because there was no one else in the room to do it. On the paperwork, I was listed as indigent, no emergency contact, no father's name anywhere on the form. I held my daughter, I named her Leia, against my chest in that cold, bright delivery room, and I made her a silent promise. I would never, not once, make her feel like a problem that someone had decided to solve by getting rid of her. What followed was 5 years that I can only describe as a slow, grinding survival. Our first apartment was a single room with black mold creeping up the bathroom wall no matter how much bleach I poured into it, and roaches that came up through the drain at night like clockwork. Leia slept in a dresser drawer lined with a folded towel because a crib was a luxury I couldn't touch. I worked at a diner just off the interstate, the kind of place where exhausted truckers and grabby men twice my age would close their hand around my wrist when I set down a plate, call me sweetheart, and leave $2 on a $40 check like that was supposed to be flattering. I smiled through it because the smile was, functionally, part of my wage. I walked 3 miles to work in the dark because the city buses didn't start running early enough for my shift. I counted loose change on the kitchen counter under a bare light bulb to figure out if we could afford the laundromat that week, or if we'd be wearing the same clothes again. There was a stretch one winter where I skipped refilling my own asthma inhaler for 2 months straight because the money had to go to formula instead, and I just breathed shallow and hoped. My father, meanwhile, lived 20 minutes away. 20 minutes in the 5-bedroom house I grew up in, with a circular driveway and a lawn service that came every single Thursday like clockwork. He told the extended family I had run off to strip in Las Vegas. Not one aunt, not one cousin, not a single person from the church we used to attend ever reached out to check if that story made any sense. Believing him was simply easier than wondering what kind of man locks his pregnant daughter out in the cold. The only person from that world who ever found me was my younger brother, Elliot. He was 3 years behind me, still living under our father's roof, still financially dependent on him for tuition. And absolutely terrified of him in that specific way kids, raised by controlling men, understand on a cellular level. But Elliot found ways. He'd text me from a friend's phone so the number wouldn't show up on the family plan. He'd meet me secretly at a park across town, with a backpack of thrift store clothes he'd bought with his own pocket money, guessing at sizes for a niece he barely knew. I remember him crying the first time he held her, this gangly 17-year-old kid, holding his niece in a public park, because that was the only safe place we had to exist together. He told me once, quietly, that he'd overheard our father on the phone telling someone I'd gone off to dance in Vegas, and that he'd wanted to scream the truth into the receiver. But he was 18 months from his own tuition payment, and he was scared, and I told him it was okay. I meant it. I never wanted my brother to set himself on fire trying to keep me warm. His $40 here and there, his secret texts, his bags of second-hand clothes, that was the only kindness that side of my family offered me for 5 straight years. And I will love him for it until the day I die. I clawed my way upward an inch at a time. I studied for my GED on the diner's Wi-Fi during my breaks, with Leia asleep in a stroller beside me. Once she turned 3, I started community college, 2 classes a semester, slowly working toward a business degree. Because I had learned the hard way that the only thing standing between my daughter and disaster was a number in a coffee can I kept taped under the sink. I found a better restaurant job, one with real tablecloths and a manager who didn't tolerate customers putting their hands on his staff. We moved into an apartment that actually had a separate bedroom. For the first time, Leia had a real bed, and she was, I say this as her mother, but also simply as a fact, an extraordinary kid. She read early. She did addition in her head at the grocery store register, calling out the total before the cashier finished scanning. Every double shift I worked, every meal I skipped so she could eat was for her. And then, last month, everything changed. A man walked into the restaurant where I worked. Expensive coat. The kind of quiet wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. An accent I couldn't immediately place. He sat down in my section and just looked at me, not the way the handsy regulars looked at me, but like he was working out a math problem. When I came to take his order, his hand was shaking slightly around the menu. Finally, he asked if I had attended freshman orientation at the state university 5 years ago that fall. My heart stopped in my chest. It was Henry. Except the man sitting in front of me now was not the drunk college kid who'd quoted Shakespeare at me on a dorm lawn. He told me his real name, Henrik, and that his family ran one of the largest shipping and renewable energy companies in Northern Europe. An old money fortune that predates his country's oil wealth entirely. At 18, on a semester abroad under a casual, anglicized name, he hadn't wanted to be the heir to anything. He just wanted, for one semester, to be a normal kid named Henry. And he'd spent one night with a girl who recited a sonnet at him while drunk and laughed at his terrible attempts at American slang. And he said he had never once stopped thinking about her. He had been searching for me for 2 full years. A cousin had shown him an old, archived photo from the university's orientation gallery, a wide shot of a welcome event, and there I was. Small in the corner, and the whole thing cracked back open inside him. He'd hired investigators. He'd spent more money chasing down a girl whose last name he'd never even known than I had earned in 5 years of waiting tables. The trail finally led from the community college to that restaurant, and he flew across an ocean and sat down in my section and ordered a coffee he never drank, just to be certain it was really me. I told him to wait. I went into the back, past the shelves of canned tomatoes, and called the woman who watched Leia to make sure she was all right. And I stood there shaking among the cans and made a decision. I came back out, sat across from him on my break, and told him he had a daughter, almost 5 years old, reads early, laughs loud. I watched a grown man come apart at a restaurant table in the middle of the afternoon. He put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and the busboys politely pretended not to notice. When he could speak again, he asked to see a photo, and I showed him the lock screen of my cracked phone, Leia at the park with chocolate ice cream smeared on her chin. He touched the screen with one finger like it might disappear if he pressed too hard. He told me his own father had spent 2 years pushing him to marry into the right family, to do the whole dynastic arrangement, and he'd kept refusing without entirely understanding why, until now. He asked what he could do, not someday, not after lawyers got involved, immediately. But even in that wrecked, overwhelmed moment, he caught himself, because he understood he was still a stranger to my daughter, and her safety was not his to demand. Within a week, on terms entirely controlled by me, things began moving in directions I had stopped letting myself imagine. He set up a trust for Leia that I could view but never touch, structured so airtight that no one, not him, not his family, not even me, could ever raid it. He bought a house and put it in my name with legal protections that I'd only later understand shielded me even from him. He insisted on backpaying 5 years of child support into an escrow account that wouldn't release a cent until paternity was legally and formally confirmed. Because he wanted everything clean and unimpeachable, not built on a handshake. His mother and one of his sisters flew in within 2 weeks. They were careful, warm, and did not push or grab. They treated the whole situation like the fragile, frightening, miraculous thing it actually was. And that, of course, is precisely when my father resurfaced. He showed up at my new front door on a Sunday afternoon, holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations, and wearing an expression I hadn't seen on his face since before my mother died. Soft. Grandfatherly, full of feeling. He stood on the porch of a house he had no part in buying and told me he'd been wrong, that he'd missed me every single day. That family forgives. That he was getting older, and life was too short to carry old wounds. The neighbors, he said, had mentioned a car in my driveway with foreign plates and a value that didn't match my old life, and delivery trucks from stores he recognized. And he'd gotten worried I'd fallen in with the wrong kind of people. I let him in. I want to be honest about why. Part of me, some small, starved animal part that had waited 5 years for him to stand on a porch and say he was wrong, wanted desperately to believe it. And part of me already suspected exactly what this was and wanted to watch it happen with my own eyes. He sat on my new couch and talked about second chances, about how young I'd been, about how he'd only ever wanted what was best for me. And then he saw the framed photo on my mantel, Leia, with Henrik's mother and sister, in a downtown hotel suite, the unmistakable backdrop of real money in the background. I watched his entire face change. The grief drained out of it, and something hungrier moved in behind his eyes. He picked up the frame. Asked, very carefully, who exactly Leia's father was, though it was obvious he already had the answer. He said the family name like it tasted like something he wanted. He suggested we plan Leia's 5th birthday together, that he'd always wanted to see the fjords this time of year. He said it the way a man reads a price tag he's already decided he can afford. That is the exact moment Henrik walked in from the kitchen, where he'd been the whole time getting Leia a glass of water, hearing every single word. My father extended his hand toward him with the practiced warmth of a man who's shaken 1,000 hands at charity galas. Already calling him son, already gushing about his precious granddaughter, Henrik looked at the offered hand like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. He didn't take it. "You're the man who locked his pregnant daughter out of the house," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. My father launched into the speech I'd heard secondhand for years. Tough love, teaching responsibility. A parent sometimes has to be hard for a child's own good. Henrik let him talk himself completely empty. Then he took out his phone. He never once raised his voice. That was the thing about him I was only beginning to understand. Real power doesn't need volume. He turned the screen around. "This is the intake form from the shelter where your daughter spent the back half of her pregnancy. There's a checkbox near the top. It says abandoned youth. Someone checked it." He swiped. "This is the county hospital record from the night your granddaughter was born. Your daughter is listed as indigent. No emergency contact. No father listed. She delivered alone." He swiped again. "This is the application for emergency housing from when she was 8 months pregnant. Would you like me to keep going?" My father opened his mouth, but Henrik kept scrolling. Calmly narrating 2 years of documentation his investigators had assembled while searching for me, the diner, the WIC enrollment, the building with the mold creeping up the bathroom wall. My father tried in a small, cracking voice to say he hadn't known how bad it had gotten, that he'd thought I'd land on my feet. Henrik just looked at him. "You live 20 minutes away," he said. "You changed the locks before you even told her to leave. You called the locksmith first." I had told him that detail myself, weeks earlier, in the restaurant. And he had filed it away. And now he set it down in front of my father like the final piece of evidence it was. My father turned to me, both hands trembling, reaching out, saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that he thought about me every day, that he'd been scared and proud and wrong. And I'll be honest with you, for 1 second, I almost felt it. 5 years of a starved animal in my chest sat up at the sound of those words. Then I looked at the grocery store flowers sitting on my own kitchen counter. I remembered he hadn't come to my porch until after the neighbors mentioned the car. I stepped back before he could touch me. I told him he needed to leave. He gathered his cheap carnations, walked toward the door, and then stopped. Whatever softness had been on his face, a moment earlier vanished completely, replaced by the same cold, calculating man who'd called a locksmith before he'd called me his daughter. "I'm her grandfather," he said, low and even. "That counts for something, there are laws." And then he walked to his car and drove away. I slid down the front door onto the floor of the house I now owned, and Henrik crouched in front of me, not touching me, just there, until my breathing came back. I understood, sitting on that floor, that the line about laws hadn't been an empty threat. My father didn't make empty threats. He made plans. And he had just told me, out loud, exactly what his next one would be. The next morning, Henrik and I sat at my kitchen table over tea that went cold in our hands, and instead of pushing for immediate involvement, he surprised me. He wanted legal paternity confirmed first, before anything else, official, protected, unimpeachable. A man who understood that trust gets built in a specific order, not at speed. 2 days later, we sat in the office of an attorney named Margaret Vance, thick carpet, framed degrees on every wall. The unhurried manner of a woman who had watched every kind of family implode and was no longer surprised by any of it. She made it clear, with Henrik confirming it out loud, that even though he was paying her fee, she worked exclusively for me. If our interests ever diverged, she was on my side of the table, full stop. When I told her what my father had said on his way out the door, she set down her pen, looked at me over her reading glasses, and said, "Good. Good that he said it where you could hear it." She explained that grandparent visitation petitions in our state were narrow. They required either an existing, substantial relationship with the child, or proof that denying contact would actually harm her. My father had neither. But a determined man with money, she warned, could still file out of pure spite and drag a family through expensive, exhausting proceedings, whether or not he ever had a real chance of winning. "The way you beat a man like that," she told me, "is you build a record so clean and so complete that a judge takes one look and is finished." And she started building it. The 5 years of backcode support went into escrow, releasing only after the official DNA test. The house, already in my name, got additional legal walls so it could never be clawed back from me, regardless of what happened between Henrik and me personally. As we wrapped up, my phone buzzed. A text from Elliot: "Dad is calling everyone, telling the family you're keeping his granddaughter from him out of spite, that you got rich and turned cruel." The old fear hit first, the cut-off, isolated feeling that had defined half a decade of my life. Then I remembered that most of those same relatives had believed I was dancing in Vegas for 5 straight years and never once called to check if I was alive. I texted Elliot back, "Don't engage, don't get caught in the middle, I have a lawyer and a plan now." He replied with one word, "Okay," and then, a minute later, "He's different this time. Be careful." I'm scared of what he'll do. My little brother had spent 18 years studying our father's moods the way sailors study weather patterns. If Elliot was scared, there was a storm coming. That evening, I sat with Leia on the edge of her bed, her stuffed fox tucked under one arm, trying to find the right size of truth for an almost 5-year-old. I told her a friend from far away, a country called Norway, across the ocean, wanted to meet her. Someone I'd known a long time ago, before she was born. I deliberately didn't use the word father, because nothing was confirmed yet, and I wasn't about to put a word that big into my daughter's mouth and then risk taking it back. She asked if he was nice. I told her we'd find out together, slowly, no rushing. She asked if he liked the same shows she did. I told her she could ask him herself, and that her feelings were entirely her own. Nobody got to tell her what they should be. She nodded like that was a fair deal, and went back to lining up her stuffed foxes by size. We met at a public park that Saturday, soft rubber ground, new equipment. Henrik came early. Simple, no gifts, no entourage, just a plain soccer ball and a nervousness he couldn't fully hide. He crouched down to her height before he said a single word, which I noticed and quietly filed away as a point in his favor. He asked what her favorite color was. "Dark green," she told him, like the deep part of a forest. They kicked the ball back and forth while I stayed close on a nearby bench. At one point, she stopped the ball with her foot, tilted her head, and asked why he talked funny. I held my breath, but he just laughed, a real warm sound, and explained he was from Norway, where the words come out shaped a little differently. She wanted to know if they had McDonald's there. He said yes, but the menu's written in Norwegian, so the words look like a secret code, and made him try to pronounce chicken nuggets in Norwegian, which sent her into hysterics on the grass. He never promised her trips, or toys, or castles. He answered every question like she was a whole, real person whose thoughts mattered, and let her come to him at her own pace instead of reaching for her. By the end of the hour, her guard had dropped enough that she was showing off how high she could pump on the swings, though she still checked over her shoulder every few minutes to make sure I hadn't moved from the bench. I never had. On the drive home, she was quiet. Then, out of nowhere, "The Norway friend is good at soccer, but bad at saying chicken nuggets." That was the whole report. 2 days later, my father left a voicemail. Wounded and magnanimous all at once, forgiving me for keeping his granddaughter from him, for letting grief over my mother fester into estrangement, for being so stubborn. "A little girl deserves her grandfather," he said. I listened to it twice and deleted it. The anger came first, hot and immediate, the sheer audacity of being forgiven for surviving what he'd done to me. Underneath the anger was just exhaustion. In his retelling, I was the one withholding, the spiteful one. Not him, the man who'd thrown me out pregnant, changed the locks, called me a disgrace, told the family I was dead. He had already rewritten the entire history. I didn't call him back. I'd spent 5 years explaining myself to people who'd already decided who I was, and I was simply done doing it. A thick envelope arrived a few days later. 5 pages in his familiar, slanted cursive, the same hand that had once signed my permission slips. The letter mixed apology language with conditions in a pattern that, once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee. He was sorry for being too hard for the years lost, and then, in the very next paragraph, he listed demands. He wanted to take Leia to the lake house. He wanted to be at her birthdays. He suggested, as though offering a generous gift, a family trip to Norway, all of us together. Every "I'm sorry" came stapled directly to a "so now you owe me." He reached for my dead mother's memory again. The way he always did when he needed leverage. As if he had any right to speak for the woman whose memory he'd weaponized against me on the very night he threw me out. It went straight into the documentation folder Margaret was building. Another exhibit. Then, one Tuesday morning, the school called. A calm, careful voice on the line. A man had come to the front office, claiming to be Leia's grandfather, asking about pickup procedures, asking what it would take to be added as an authorized adult. My blood went cold and then hot in the same instant. I drove the 6 blocks faster than I should have. The director met me in the lobby and immediately reassured me they'd released nothing. No schedule, no confirmation she even attended there. The moment his story didn't match the authorized list, they'd ended the conversation and he'd left. That was his pattern, I understood, watching my daughter chase a friend on the playground through the window, gloriously unaware. He didn't kick down doors. He found the unlocked window. I filled out a formal restriction form right there at the counter, my handwriting shaking, listing exactly who was allowed near my daughter, and instructing them to call me immediately if anyone else tried. Margaret sent him a formal no-contact letter the next day. No approaching Leia, her school, or her caregivers. No contact with me except through my attorney. Signing off on it made me sick with an old, conditioned guilt. The lifelong training of a daughter taught that keeping the peace was her job. But underneath, the sickness was something new. A clean, strange strength. The feeling of finally choosing my daughter's safety over my father's comfort. A reporter called not long after. Someone had apparently caught wind of a story about a Norwegian shipping heir and a secret American daughter, circulating in certain online circles. My hands shook so badly I dropped a fork. Margaret's instructions were simple, total silence. No comment, no correction, nothing. A story like this runs on fuel, she told me. Every quote, every denial, every off-record conversation is oxygen. Starve it completely, and it dies of boredom in a matter of days. We treated silence as the strongest weapon we had. The DNA test happened on a Monday morning, official forms, sealed samples, a lab technician narrating every step for the record. Leia giggled the whole time and asked if they were checking for cavities like the dentist did. 3 days later, The results arrived by courier, sealed and notarized, confirming in cold clinical percentages what we'd both known the moment Henrik sat down in my section. He was her father. We told her together, simply calmly, sitting on the couch. Henrik told her, in the gentlest voice I'd ever heard from a grown man, that he was her daddy, that nobody had told him she existed, but the very minute he found out. He'd crossed an entire ocean to be with her, and he wanted to be her daddy for the rest of her life, if she would let him. She went very still, the way kids do when something enormous is settling into them. She didn't cry or cheer, she thought. Then she asked if this meant she had grandparents in Norway, the way her friend at school had grandparents in another state. We told her yes, a whole family across the ocean who wanted to meet her whenever she felt ready, and not 1 second before. She nodded slowly, taking inventory of her suddenly much larger world, then picked her crayons back up and went upstairs to be alone with it. I understood completely. Some news is too big to wear in front of other people until you've tried it on by yourself first. Henrik put his face in his hands after she left the room, his shoulders shaking, silent this time. I sat next to a man crying over a daughter he'd found, and a word he'd waited 2 years to finally say out loud, and I let him have it. Not everything that hurts is bad. Sometimes it hurts because, after far too long, it's finally going right. A child therapist named Dr. Reyes started working with us, helping Leia process the sudden, enormous change in her world. At one session, asked to draw her family, she put herself in the middle with a thought bubble above her head, filled entirely with question marks. When asked what she was wondering, she said, in that matter-of-fact way kids deliver the things that absolutely gut you, that she was scared her daddy would go away again, the way he had before. Even though she knew it wasn't his fault, because nobody had told him she was born. The only answer to that fear was time. Showing up, being boring and reliable for long enough that it finally registered in her body as true. Henrik took that instruction like a man receiving orders for the most important assignment of his life, which it was, and he started showing up every single time. Never late, never canceled. Mediation began with a woman named Dolores Kemp. My father arrived on time, in a good suit, performing graciousness. He cried almost immediately, talked about grief and fear and tough love, and every time he tried to wrap an action back inside an excuse. Dolores gently stopped him and reminded him the exercise was acknowledgement without justification. He genuinely could not do it. To name what he'd done without the protective layer of his reasons was, for him, like standing naked in front of the act itself, and he had spent 5 years constructing those reasons specifically so he'd never have to. Margaret watched the supervised visits begin to roll in, every other weekend, 30 minutes at a time, a $5 budget for crayons, no gifts allowed, and warned me not to relax. He didn't agree to these strict terms because he's humble, she told me. He agreed because he believes he can charm his way through any room and still get what he wants. Keep the file current anyway. I privately thought she'd simply seen too many bad cases to recognize a good one when it showed up. I kept the file current anyway because some instinct older than my hope agreed with her. Months passed. The compliance was flawless. No gifts, no secrets, no pushed boundaries, no test of any unlocked window. The very thing I knew, in my bones, was his actual nature. He showed up, colored quietly at a small table, waved at her from the edge of birthday parties, and left exactly on time, every single time. The lack of drama unsettled me more than drama ever could have. And slowly, against my own better judgment, some small, starved part of me began to soften. Maybe people change, I let myself think, late at night, looking at a folder of clean therapy attendance forms. My own life had genuinely started to open. A full acceptance letter arrived from the community college, a real degree program at last, business administration, the thing I'd been chipping away at 2 classes per semester for years. The financial fear that used to choke every decision simply wasn't there anymore. I sat with that letter and thought about the version of myself who'd studied for her GED on a diner's Wi-Fi with a baby asleep in a stroller. And I wanted to reach back through the years and tell her to hold on. And exactly that moment, the moment the ground finally felt solid, was the moment my father had been waiting for. A man who plans his cruelty down to the locksmith does not strike while his target is braced and watching. He waits until she set her guard down. Until she started, against her own instincts, to hope. He waits until she's standing on what feels like solid ground. Then he files. Margaret called me on a Thursday afternoon, and I knew from the first syllable of her voice that the ground was gone again. My father had filed a formal petition for grandparent visitation rights. I sat on my kitchen floor, the same way I had the night he stood in my living room and told me there were laws. Margaret let the silence sit for a moment, then said quietly, "I told you to keep the file current." And then, "Do you understand what he did? He didn't comply because he changed. He complied because he was building evidence. Every visit you granted him in good faith, he logged as proof of an existing relationship. The birthday wave, the coloring sessions, his petition cites all of it. He manufactured the relationship the law requires, on your dime and your mercy, and now he's holding it up to a judge as the reason he deserves more." I understood in that moment that he had never once stopped being the man who called the locksmith first. He had simply found a slower, more patient locksmith. That night I called Henrik, who booked a flight before I even had to ask. I called Elliot. And that's when the case cracked wide open, because it turned out that even after Elliot had drawn his own boundary and refused to be the family's go-between, our father had kept texting him anyway. He assumed, the way men like him always assume, that blood equals loyalty forever, that a boundary was just a phase his son would eventually drop. He needed someone to be impressed by his own cleverness, and he could never imagine that his own son had quietly stopped being that someone. Elliot had screenshotted every text. In his own words, in writing, my father had laid out the entire plan, playing the long game. You don't get into a fortune like that by kicking down the door, you get in by becoming the grandfather no court will deny. The therapy is a box to check, the visits are the whole point. Once the relationship's established, the trust will have to come to the table, because no judge keeps a grandfather from a child over money. He had written, in plain text, that he'd always wanted to see Norway, and that he intended to, on someone else's dime, as the child's grandfather within a few years. He had told the truth, in writing, to the one person he was completely sure would never betray him, and that person had chosen me. Margaret called back near 11 that night, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was something almost warm in her voice. "He built his whole case on looking like a loving grandfather," she said. "And your brother just handed me his written confession that the love was a strategy, and the strategy was the trust fund." The 6 weeks before the hearing were strange and suspended. Margaret built her case methodically. The shelter intake form with its checked box, the hospital record listing me as indigent, the housing application from 8 months pregnant, the 5-page letter stapling apology to demand, the Facebook album titled My Pride and Joy, 30 photographs, every single one from before the 5 years he'd told everyone I was dead. And not one from after, my own dated journal, the no-contact letter, the school incursion report. And at the center of it all, the texts. My father's own written confession that the love was a ledger, and the ledger pointed straight at my daughter's trust fund. Elliot agreed to testify, knowing it might cost him his last semester's tuition. He did it anyway. "You carried me when we were kids," he told me the night before. "When Dad was at his worst and Mom was sick, you stood between me and him 100 times. Let me stand once." The courtroom itself was small, fluorescent, nothing like television. My father sat at the petitioner's table in his best suit, hands folded, face arranged into careful sorrow. His attorney told a beautifully constructed story: a reformed grandfather, completed therapy, faithful supervised visits, a daughter grown cold and vindictive after coming into sudden wealth. Then Margaret stood. She agreed, gently, that the bond between grandparent and grandchild deserves protection, when it actually exists. And then she asked the court's permission to examine exactly when this one had begun. Document by document, in flat, clean language, she walked it all the way back. The 2-hour eviction the locksmith called before a word was said. The indigent birth 20 minutes from his front door, the 5 years of silence, the album with not one photo of the granddaughter he now called cherished. Then she called Elliot to the stand. Pale, in a borrowed tie, he authenticated the messages without once looking at our father. Margaret read them into the record in her level, unhurried voice, and the room went completely silent. Playing the long game. The therapy is a box to check. No judge keeps a grandfather from a child over money. The opposing attorney did not rise to object. You cannot object to a man's own written confession. I made myself look at my father then, and I watched the careful sorrow slide off his face, replaced by the cold, calculating man from my porch, the man who had called the locksmith first. For 1 second, he looked at his own son on the stand with something like genuine disbelief, as though the betrayal belonged to Elliot and not to him. Elliot held his gaze and did not look away. That, more than any single document, was the moment my father actually lost. The judge took barely 20 minutes. She found that the entire relationship the petition relied on had been, by the petitioner's own written admission, a deliberate construction undertaken for financial gain, and that rewarding it would mean rewarding the manipulation of the court itself. She denied the petition in full, with prejudice, barring him from ever refiling, and noted for the record that it had been brought in bad faith. The relationship a grandparent earns, she told him from the bench, is not the same as the one a grandparent litigates. You have shown this court only the second kind. Then she closed the file and called the next case. I stood up. I didn't say anything to him. There was nothing left to say that the judge hadn't already said better. Elliot came down off the stand and stood on one side of me. Henrik stood on the other. Neither one of them in front of me, both of them beside me, and I walked past my father's table toward the door. He said my name once, low, the exact way he'd once said the word disgrace, slow, deliberate, like he was tasting it. I didn't stop walking. I had a daughter waiting at home who knew absolutely nothing about any of this, who was, at that very moment, probably counting gold star stickers on her bedroom calendar, who would never sleep in a dresser drawer or feel for 1 single second like a problem somebody had quietly solved by getting rid of her. I pushed open the courtroom door and walked out into the daylight, and I did not look back. Because the man behind me had finally, after 6 years and a locksmith and a courtroom entirely of his own making, become exactly what he had once called me on the worst night of my life, a disgrace. And for the first time, it wasn't mine to carry anymore. If this story hit you the way it hit us, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of family, betrayal, and the long road back to justice.